Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. Today's video is something that surprisingly I have actually never done, even though I've been on BookTube now for going on 4 years. I'm going to be talking about my all-time favorite books as of 2021. So it is February 2021, and while this list may shift and change in the future, as of right now, the books that I'm going to share with you are my top 10 most favorite books of all time that I have ever read. I'm not quite sure how I managed to get this far in my BookTube career without having made this video, maybe because I just didn't want to have to decide like what were and weren't my most favorite books. And honestly, it took me a while to narrow down this list and figure out like, no, but really the top 10, what are they? Because there were things that were close, didn't quite make it. So I do want to talk a little bit about how I curated this list. One thing that for me in an all-time favorite book is really important is rereadability. All of these are either books that I have read multiple times over the years or really want to read again in the future. And like whenever I talk about them, I'm like, I really want to read this again, because I don't feel that way about all books. There are a lot of books that I enjoy in the moment, but then I'm kind of like, okay, that was great. Let's move on to the next thing. But these are books that I love. They are books that I either have a lot of nostalgia for, books that left a big emotional imprint in me, books that have stuck with me in some way. And I think you'll see as I get to what they are, why they mean a lot to me. But these are my 10 most favorite books, books that mean a lot to me, that I love. There were books that came close to making on this list. Some of them are things where I was like, no, that's something where I feel like I really would need to read it again to decide for sure, or like have some more time away from it before I can decide. As I said, this list could shift somewhat in the future, but as of right now, these are my favorites. Okay, so I have not put these in order from least to most favorite because I cannot do that to myself. So instead, what I'm going to do is start with the books that have been my favorites for the longest, and then maybe move up to my most recent favorites. I think that might be an interesting way to organize this. The first book on this list is one that has been one of my all-time favorite books since I was 7 years old. When I first got this series from my parents, this series as a whole introduced me to fantasy, and I love it and have a lot of nostalgia for it. But this book in particular was always my favorite. So I'm going to show you my very old beat up copy from when I was 7, and then I'll show you like a newer one. This is The Voyage of the Dawn Treader by C.S. Lewis. It is part of the Chronicles of Narnia. This was my copy growing up. I still have these. They mean a lot to me and I love them a lot. I did buy new copies for my kids to read because, you know, like definitely a series I want to pass on. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader was always such a wonderfully magical book to me. It's interesting too because it's a voyage book. It's a book where the characters are traveling as they're growing through their character arcs. And in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they visit all of these different islands and places. And like there's cool, interesting places, magical places, spooky places. And I just loved it. This is one that I would read over and over again because I always loved it so much, and it just came alive in my imagination. It was definitely my favorite of the series. Favorite of a favorite series. And it's interesting because now I am very picky about road trip books and voyage books. I'm kind of a hard sell on them. This, I think, is an example of where it's done really well, where all of the places they went were really interesting and it was connected with the growth and development of the characters in a way that I just found really compelling and not boring. So yeah, this is a book that has been a favorite for me the longest of anything else, and I love it a whole lot. Also, this and with the next book I'm going to talk about, I don't think I would ever see these books not be in my top 10. I would be shocked if this was ever not one of my all-time favorite books. So yeah. The next book is one that I reread recently, so maybe this won't come as a surprise to you guys, but that is Alana the First Adventure by Tamora Pierce. I'm currently doing a read-along of the whole series, The Quartet with Ashley from Bookish Realm, and we just did a live show about the first book. I love this series so much. It means a lot to me, and it was really huge for me reading it as a young person. I was probably like 11 or 12 when I picked these up for the first time. And I think that this was probably my first introduction to feminism. And also growing up in a more religious household and conservative household, it was probably the first place that I ever saw a more sex positive approach to sexuality for girls, for teenagers, with like addressing birth control, where it wasn't all just about being married. And I definitely did not talk to my parents about the fact that there was a little bit of that in the series. But I just love these. I identified so much with Alana as a young woman growing up because she doesn't want to be shoehorned into this idea of what a gender role should be. She does not want to be forced to go to finishing school. She wants to become a knight, and she's a total badass and learns how to accept the different parts of herself as she grows and develops. And I related a lot to this. I grew up with all younger brothers, and it took me time to come to terms with accepting both my feminine side and my, like, I want to tear down the world sort of side. You know, especially when these came out, there just weren't a lot of other books like this being published. When I read them, certainly, there weren't heroines like this for young teenagers and for young girls to read about. And, you know, now there are a lot more, but this was published in 1983, and I probably picked it up in like the mid to late 90s. And you know, anyway, I just love it a lot. The whole series means a lot to me, but Alana the First Adventure is definitely an all-time favorite book for me. It has been for a very long time. Next up, we have a couple of classics. I have always really enjoyed classics. I read a lot of them when I was a teenager, and this is one that I think I first read when I was like 10 or 11. It's another one that my parents got me a copy for Christmas. I still have it somewhere, but I'm going to show you a nicer copy. This is Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. I love this book so much. I have reread it multiple times over the years, and it just, like, it's so cozy and so comforting. I love the March sisters and getting to just be a part of their world as they grow up and come of age and figure out what they want and work through their issues with each other. Like I said, I didn't have sisters, so I probably enjoyed reading about like a group of sisters for that reason, but I also had a lot of siblings, and so it was relatable to me reading about the complicated sibling dynamics that can come up. Looking back, I think the first time I read this, I didn't really grasp everything in here. It was like a pretty high reading level. So when I read it at like 10 or 11, was I understanding everything? No, obviously not. But I've reread this multiple times over the years. I also love the different adaptations of it on film. And yeah, it's a great book. I always loved Jo as a heroine. I mean, again, like you're seeing a theme here, right? Like these kind of badass heroines who like don't quite fit and are, you know, want more than what's necessarily expected of them. Like that was always very relatable to me. And this, I think, is also always going to be a favorite for me. Next is another classic that I read for the first time as a teenager. I don't remember exactly how old I was when I read this for the first time. Probably like 14-ish, I'm guessing. And it's another book that I love a whole lot. And that is Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. I love this book. I'm probably about due for another reread of this book, actually, but Jane is such a great character. I love her. I love her arc with Mr. Rochester. I love the bittersweet ending of this, and I love all of the minutia and the details and just being in this world. It's so vivid to me, and it really came alive to me when I was reading it as a young person, and I've just continued to love it a whole lot. Like, I don't know what else to say about it, but I love Jane. And I think I also loved the fact that she was a heroine who was plain. She didn't come from an easy background. She didn't necessarily have a lot financially, and, you know, like the main thing she was good at was her drawing. And I don't know, I liked that. I liked the idea of having a heroine who didn't have to be great at everything, who didn't have to necessarily even be beautiful, but had her own sort of beauty. You know, she's not very good at playing the piano. She's not very good at like a lot of things, but she knows who she is, and she's got this inner strength and confidence, and I don't know. I just love Jane Eyre a lot. This makes me want to reread it. This is what I'm going to keep saying about all these books. I'm going to want to reread all of them, but this is another one that I read when I was young, have reread it over the years, and it's definitely an all-time fave. Okay, so we have 2 more that are books that I read pre-BookTube, and then 5 of them that I've read since starting BookTube, which I think is interesting that like half of my all-time favorite list is things that I've read since joining BookTube, and I think have probably displaced other things that I still have a lot of love for, but aren't necessarily on this list anymore. Anyway, that said, my next favorite book is something that I read in my 20s. This is The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. The nerd in me just adores this book so much. It's kind of a gothic mystery, but like so much of this book takes place in the stacks of libraries and like looking at old documents and doing historical research, and I just like eat that shit up. Like so much. This book follows a woman who is working on her PhD in history, and she is researching the life of Vlad Dracul, who is the person that the legends of Dracula were based on, except that perhaps he's more than just a myth. This is a very slow-paced, kind of dark academia book, and I just love it. It's not everybody's cup of tea. Like, I think if you don't like this sort of thing, you would probably think it's boring and like the plot takes forever to actually get anywhere. But if you enjoy the process of uncovering research and spending time in libraries and slowly discovering like all of these things in documents and like reading journals, like, I don't know, it's great. I loved it a lot. I love the vibes. Definitely an all-time favorite for me. Another one I could do a reread of, but yeah, this was fun. So this, like, I probably read in like my early 20s. I probably read this in like my early 20s. So next, for a book that I read in my late 20s for the first time, and you know, I only read this one once, but it left such a strong impression on me emotionally. I continue to think about it to this day. I should do a reread, but it's one of those books where I'm worried. I don't know if anyone else gets like this. I don't get this way about most books, but this is a book where I'm worried that reading it again will lessen the emotional impact, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I would read it again and I would still feel the same way, but like the memory of how I felt reading this book is so strong. Anyway, the book is The Ocean at the End of the Lane by Neil Gaiman. Guys, it's not very long. It's kind of more of a novella, I guess, or a short novel. And it is a darker fantasy that is mostly about a young boy, but we start off with the man as a grown man who's returning to his childhood home after, I think, the death of his father. And then he starts to remember things that happened there when he was like 10. And I don't want to like spoil what happens, but there's like dark magical things about this. It might sound like a middle grade book, but it's not. It's like a book about children written for adults. And I think the thing that really struck me about this book is it reminded me what it felt like to be a child. I've never really read another author who can do that the way that Neil Gaiman does it here, but this made me remember what it felt like to be a child, the way I processed things, the way I thought about things, and I just felt like he nailed it, at least in my experience. The main character is experiencing a lot of trauma in his real life, and we don't know for sure if the fantastical element of this is real or if it's just his coping mechanism, how he's coping with the trauma he's experiencing, but it kind of doesn't matter whether it's real or not. I don't know. I love this a lot. I should try a reread, even if I'm nervous about what it would be like on a second read, but I love this. It's something that I continue to think about, and the memory of the experience of reading this has stayed so strong for me. So definitely. And maybe that's surprising. It's not something I've really talked about on this channel because it's something I read before I started my BookTube channel, but yeah, one that I really love a whole lot. All right. That said, I have 5 books left to talk about, and these are going to be in no particular order because they are all books that I've read like 2 to 3 years ago, and they're books that I've read since joining BookTube. I did not include any of the books that I read in 2020. I don't feel like I have enough distance from those books yet to know if they would be included on this list, so everything is something that I read in 2019 or prior. And, you know, this could shift in future years. First up, and this had to go on here because this author is also one of my now all-time favorite auto-buy authors. This is The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin. Guys, this book is amazing. The whole series is amazing. It is a masterpiece and I love it so, so much, but I'm going to put the first book as my favorite because I really want to reread these books. Like, what else? What you're gonna keep hearing? I really want to reread these books so desperately with people and talk about them. These are books that I feel like you could read them over and over again and get something new from them every time. They are so nuanced and so layered. You could read them just for the basic story and it would be good, but then you could go back and you could get at the way that she builds these complicated characters, at the world building, at the magic system, at the thematic content that she's talking about. Like, there's so much here. It's so rich, and I just like to be inside N.K. Jemisin's mind. She's brilliant. And I love this book so much. And this is something that I've said in other places, and I'll say it again. There is a lot that could be said about this book, about the brilliance of the setup, about the characters, about the way that this and further books in the series deal with big, difficult topics like oppression and xenophobia and complicated family relationships, mother-child relationships, romantic relationships. Like, there's just so much covered in here that we could talk about. But one thing that I think is just a snippet to give you a sense of what an incredible author N.K. Jemisin is and how nuanced her characters and their relationships with each other are. The Fifth Season is one of the only books I have ever read where an author has really made me root for a polyamorous relationship. I know there are people who really like reading this in books. I am a tough sell on it because most of the time I don't really buy it in terms of emotional stuff. It's one thing, like, I think in romances, like, sometimes it's thrown in there more as like a kink thing than it is about the actual romantic arc. But I'm talking about a thing where there's a polyamorous relationship where I really believe these people all deeply love and care for each other and should be together and have created a family. This is one of the only examples I can think of where I really, really believed in it. So I think that is just a testament to the kinds of characters and the kinds of nuanced interactions that N.K. Jemisin is able to build. And of course, because this is the book that it is, and because it's not a romance, things don't go well for that polyamorous relationship. But yeah, anyway. I could gush a whole lot about this. I need to just do a reread of the series or do a read along or something and I've had people ask about that. It may be coming, guys. It may be coming. I love these. Yeah, and I love N.K. Jemisin. Okay, I'll stop gushing. This is gonna be such a long video. Okay, the next book on this list is another one that I just connected with very deeply on a personal and emotional level. It's a book that made me feel very seen in many ways, and that is Circe by Madeline Miller. This is a retelling of Greek mythology, specifically the life of the witch Circe. And, this is not everybody's cup of tea. It is very slow paced. It's very character driven. Like, the plot is super slow. There's not a lot of plot that happens. Like, you are reading this to connect with Circe as a character and to be there for her journey through life. I loved it. I loved the way that it depicted her as a woman who wants more than what's given to her in a patriarchal society. I loved the way that this handled her becoming a mother and the complexities of that. It really, really resonated with me, and I felt like I shared a lot of similar feelings and experiences, not in every way, but there were things about it that felt very similar to my own experiences of those things. And yeah, I don't know. I loved this a lot. It really resonated with me, and I thought it was beautifully written. Madeline Miller did an incredible job with this and really brought Circe to life on the page. I feel like all of my favorite books. Yeah, I mean, I think pretty much all of my favorite books are either your thing or they're not. Like, they're not everybody's cup of tea. You have to like the kind of book it is, which is fine. But I loved this one a whole hell of a lot. 2 books to go. We have an epic fantasy and then we have a nonfiction title. So for epic fantasy, it's The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Guys, I love this book so freaking much. This is like everything that I love in an epic fantasy. And thank you to Leanna from Leanna's Library for pushing me to read it. It was so funny because I read this because of her, because she was be like, Bethany, have you read it yet? Have you read it yet? Are you gonna read Name of the Wind? When are you gonna read Name of the Wind? And so finally I was like, okay, fine, I'll read Name of the Wind. And then I devoured it in like 3 days, and I have been obsessed ever since. I love it. This is another book that is very rereadable, because if you read this and then future books in the series, you can go back and there are details that make sense in new ways. It's so nuanced. I love authors who have this kind of rich world building where you can read it just for the story, but you can go back and you can pick up on nuanced details of what they're putting into it. N.K. Jemisin does the same thing. It's a world that really feels lived in. He's thought about things like the financial systems and cross-boundary politics and like cultural things, and I just love all of that. The writing is really poetic and beautiful. I also just love Kvothe as a character, and I feel like Kvothe is very polarizing. Like, there are people who don't like him very much, but I really do. I love his journey in this book specifically, and all of the places that it goes. And unpopularly, I also really like Denna, his love interest. I think she's such an interesting character. I think it's interesting that she is who Kvothe really loves. There's a lot of hate for her, but I love her. I love Kvothe. I love this book. I love everything about it. I think it's just wonderful and totally my cup of tea. Wise Man's Fear has a few things in it that I didn't love quite as much, so it's not one of my all-time favorites, even though I still did mostly really like it. But yeah, Name of the Wind, man, love it so much. Holds a special place in my heart. For sure needed to be on this list. And then the final book of my top 10 most favorite books of all time is a nonfiction pick that I think is an absolute masterpiece and should be required reading for everybody. That is Stamped from the Beginning: The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America by Ibram X. Kendi. This was a National Book Award winner, and it is like thoroughly deserved it. This book is incredible. It traces the history of racist ideas all the way back to like the 1500s up through modern day and the Barack Obama presidency. And it's brilliant, it's nuanced, it's thought-provoking. You will learn a lot from it that you did not know before. And I also just really love Ibram X. I love everything Ibram X. Kendi does. So at this point, pretty much anything he puts out or writes, I'm probably going to buy and read. But I think that this is incredible. Of course, I've also read Stamped, which is the YA adaptation, which I think is a really good entry point. If this feels intimidating because it is a tome, I think that's a good place to start. But I do think everybody should really read this. We also own Anti-Racist Baby. I've pre-ordered the kids version of Stamped, which is coming out in May. You know, I was telling my husband about this and he was joking. They should just make like a family boxed set of like all the different editions for everyone in the family. He's not wrong. Like, they really should do something like this. But yeah, I think this is a beautiful book. It's an important book. It's one that I really loved. Another one I want to revisit in the future. And yeah, definitely one of my all-time faves. So there you have it. A lot of backstory, a lot of feelings. I feel very strongly about all of these books, as I should. I read a lot, but these are my 10 all-time favorites. Talk to me in the comments down below. Let me know your thoughts or feelings on anything that I talked about in this video. And for question of the day, tell me about one of your all-time favorite books. What is it? Why do you love it as much as you do? Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you want to support the work of the channel, check out the Patreon linked down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.